in St. Louis metropolitan area. This is for a state implementation plan in that particular geographic zone. The pollutant type is specified here, and this is the important message coming out of this table. Could you have achieved these same targets with more efficient allocation of resources? That is to say, incurring less costs. The worst example here is a study that was done in lower Delaware Valley, and it turned out that the command and control policies, those targets could have been achieved much more efficiently. In fact, the cost associated with command and control was fundamentally 22 times higher than the least cost alternative. One that's reasonably close is a study that was done in Santiago, Chile. Well, actually, there's a closer one up here, California Emission Standards, Los Angeles. There, the actual command and control policies were very close to the least cost efficient pursuit of whatever those targets were. Okay, now moving away from command and control, if we're not going to implement command and control, what are our choices? We've already discussed all of those choices, but now we're going to look at those choices with regard to air pollution. One choice is cap and trade, right? Another choice is corrected taxes, right? Now we're going to introduce a new policy instrument or a new policy by government, namely cost-effective taxes. That is to say, I want to achieve the standard. Now, what is the cost-effective tax for doing so? Yes? Yeah, if they're less aggressive standards, is that your point? If they're less aggressive standards, that's true. Your intuition is correct. But at the same time, whatever the standards are, what that last column is attempting to measure, I don't care what your standards are. You give me the standards. I'll look at what cost you actually incurred versus what cost you could have incurred to achieve that same standard. Yeah. Okay. Sticking with California, in particular Southern California, smog trading. California introduced a program called the RECLAIM program, which is the Regional Clean Air Incentives Market. And fundamentally, this is an economist's prescription. Let's create the right incentives for reducing the incidence of smog. And in this program, 400 stationary polluters were identified, and each of them received a pollution standard, namely a standard or limit they couldn't violate. But in addition to that, that limit over a 10-year period of time was specified to be reduced by a fixed percentage. So in terms of planning, each of those 400 polluters can start to adapt because next year it's going to be a 5% decrease in that limit, the following year it may be 7, 8, 9, and that allows them to adjust and plan for what the new standards or limits will be that are set. In addition, they set up a market for trading those rights or permits for pollution. And as we saw when we set up that market, that the market itself can create the incentives for polluters, the low-cost polluters, to actually end up selling their rights and for the high-cost polluters to buy those rights. Yes? Yes?
So EPA sets a standard, and both companies try to achieve these cost savings anyway, so how do they calculate the is it retain those same standards, like to achieve these costs? Is that with that?
The standards are the same, okay? The standards, so that becomes the benchmark. They went out and measured what the actual costs were, and then said, now I come along, and could I design a more efficient mechanism? For example, suppose I've got some polluters that are much more efficient than other polluters, and I end up reallocating the burden with regard to controlling pollution among them. Okay? All right? Okay. The benefits of smog trading. Cost effectiveness is assured. And as we saw in one of our earlier lectures, the government, which I've listed here in the second point, the control authority is the government, right? The control authority doesn't have to know each and every polluter's cost of controlling pollution. And in this kind of setting, the polluters have a strong incentive not only to reduce emission, but also to prevent it. Why? Because it has some value to them. Now we've changed their incentives. And in changing their incentives, they can make a business, if you will, out of becoming more efficient and selling their pollution rights to others that are not as efficient as they are. Under smog trading, this is the bullet here, preventing emission allows firms to sell the credits, and they end up gaining value from doing so. Now, the caveat here, I've got will not work if the cap is set too low. You can also change that and say another caveat, it won't work if the cap is set too high. Right? Yes?
So the emission credits are a common thing that I've seen, but like, for example, is this California Regional Clean Air Incentives Market a closed market in itself?
Yes. 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 Right. Okay. Now, two other policies aside from cap and trade, one of which we have defined some time ago, namely efficiency charge. The efficiency charge is also corrective taxes, what we call corrective taxes. It's one and the same. And the efficiency charges are trying to create the right incentives to tax the polluters to reflect the external costs or externalities that they're generating through their pollution of air quality. A cost-effective charge is designed to create the incentive to meet the standard. Right? And those two will converge to be the same if and only if the standard is fortuitously the optimal point where incremental social benefits equal incremental social costs. There wouldn't be any distinction, but in the real world there's a serious distinction between the two. Right? Okay, let's turn to hazardous pollutants. Okay, the regulation process, as I've already noted, this is one of the programs of the Environmental Protection Agency. And whenever a new substance is found to have a causal pathway to health hazards or to degradation of human health, then EPA has a responsibility to come out and regulate and set standards for those particular pollutants. And as we'll see later, EPA actually incorporates risk assessments along with their standard benefit cost methodology. We'll talk about that later. Let's turn to mobile source. Up till now in this lecture we've talked only about stationary sources. Now we want to look at mobile sources of pollution, and this is pollution that comes largely from vehicles. And if you look at smog and most of the air quality in the concentrated urban areas, much of the degradation of air quality is sourced with mobile vehicles, in contrast to stationary vehicles, right? The mobile sources contribute much of the proportion of pollution in the form of ozone, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide. This has been well documented scientifically. There's very little debate about this in contrast to the polarization that has existed within our society about global warming, for example. This has all been scientifically documented and measured. Now, the governmental policies bite at two different points. One, they bite at the point of the manufacturer of the vehicles, or two, they bite at the user of those vehicles. Okay? And those policies have different incentive effects. And we want to look at what some of those incentive effects are and which of the two policy focuses is the most efficient from the standpoint of the public interest. And by the way, whenever I use public interest, I'm defining that very precisely. The public interest is setting the marginal social value equal to the marginal social cost, because that is the point at which social efficiency is maximized. All right, so let's look at the economics of mobile source pollution. Let's first examine what are the governmental policies that result in more movement of vehicles and thus more potential pollution. Road construction and maintenance costs. Now, why do I call this an implicit subsidy? Heard any of you? Why is it an implicit subsidy? When you drive a vehicle from Berkeley to Davis, do you incur the cost of the road, aside from the toll bridge at, where's that toll bridge? Cortinas, right? That's the only toll that you pay from Berkeley to Davis, right? Do you incur the cost, as a driver of a vehicle, the cost of that road construction and maintenance? Yes? Right, so you don't, even though there's, your point's well taken, there's a gasoline tax, and that tax is supposed to be used to maintain roads and moreover invest in roads, the tax isn't sufficient to cover all of those costs. So you don't bear the full cost, that's the point. So if you don't bear the full cost, there's an implicit subsidy there. And if you look at the cost of driving an extra mile, it's not zero, I understand, but it is very close to zero. One more mile is just the gas that you burn and what is the cost of replacing that gas. And moreover, you don't pay the road construction or maintenance for another mile driven. The social costs are borne by taxpayers, in large part, and the net result of this implicit subsidy, everything else constant, is too many miles driven. Now, there are parts of the country, or part of the Bay Area, where parking costs are very high. I understand that. When I first arrived at Berkeley from Boston, it turned out there was no parking fee on the Berkeley campus. It was zero. And then suddenly it's steadily creeped up. Why did it creep up? Because parking space became a scarce resource, and they had to use prices to ration the resource, which is what they've done. And I think now parking in C is something like $1,400 a year. Quite a difference. But is that the real cost? Is there an implicit subsidy there? Is the real cost something larger than $1,400? And if it is, that too encourages too much driving. Instead of walking to work, everything else constant, there is more driving than would otherwise exist. Another source of externalities with regard to mobile source pollution, accidents. The social cost of accidents clearly is a positive function of the number of miles driven. And you can't drive in the state of California legally without insurance, right? And that insurance is generally lump sum insurance. Sweep aside for the moment the complexity associated with getting a ticket for an accident and your premiums increasing, right? Let's not introduce that complication right at this moment. The fundamental point still holds even under that complexity, is that the private cost, the incremental cost that you face as a result of an accident in the very, very short run is zero. Again, everything else constant, that results in too much driving. Road congestion. As more and more drivers find their way on to roadways, congestion increases, that takes you more time. Now your opportunity cost of time has gone up, right? And with congestion and more drivers comes a higher level of pollution finding its way into air quality. Now the consequences of all this is that these implicit subsidies, and the subsidies are in effect costs that are external, that result in some externalities. And as a result, the general conclusion is the roads faced or are used by far too many vehicles, there's too many trips taken, and there are too many miles driven, and, with regard to our current examination about air pollution, too much pollution. And because of those subsidies, alternative modes of transportation are not as intensely used as they would be if those implicit subsidies weren't there. That is to say, there would be more bus, more BART, more public transportation if you reduced all of those subsidies or eliminated them. Now, policies toward mobile sources of pollution. This originated with the Clean Air Act of 1965, which set the standards for hydrocarbon and carbon monoxide emissions from automobiles. The automobile industry pushed and lobbied heavily for a common U.S. standard. And the reason they did so, they didn't want to manufacture one type of car for one state and another type of car for a different state. And they obviously ended up prevailing, aside from California that got out in front of the federal government and established their standards earlier. And subsequently, there was a clear Clean Act amendment of 1970 that set emission standards that required emissions to be reduced by 90%, a very aggressive program. And to achieve that outcome, the actual policy design on the part of the government looked at both the point of production and the end user. Now, I referred to that a moment ago about where does the policy bite? Does it bite at the manufacturing level, or does it bite with regard to the drivers or users of these vehicles? And that's what we want to look at now. The point of production, this is the certification program that requires all new automobiles to satisfy and conform to the federal standards with regard to emissions. Another point of production, the elimination of lead gasoline. If you walked into a gas station 20 years ago, they would have leaded and unleaded, right? Leaded is now illegal. It's prohibited. So it's all unleaded gasoline. A program that exists with regard to the end user or the actual user of vehicles is the smog test program. And by the way, stop and ask yourself about current California policies. How many in here own a car? Okay. Your DVM license fees. The older your car, the smaller the license fee, right? Right? Because it's based on the value of the car. But why shouldn't it be based on the value of the damage that car does? I mean, older cars. I mean, the one thing they have you do is go out and you've got to, before you can get your license, you have to go to some service vendor who examines your car to make sure that it's not emitting hydrocarbons above a certain standard, right? And once you've got that approval, then you can get your license. But if you want to create the right incentives with respect to people moving away from cars that are less efficient, there should be some incremental fee associated with driving that car on roadways, resulting in more pollution than an efficient automobile. Yes? I'm sorry, I don't understand. The cost of pollution would be great. Right. Oh, I see. Yes. No, no. By the way, that problem you've just isolated is a huge public debate about ethanol now, and what is the actual carbon emissions associated with producing corn that you convert into ethanol, and maybe you save in terms of the amount of carbon emissions on just ethanol. But what about the production process up to that point? That's what is that an analogy? Because you're saying, but if the but listen, the manufacturers are still producing automobiles, right? To survive, they have to continue to produce automobiles. So you have to. Your point is, you have to look at what would they do in the counterfactual world. Namely, would they still be producing? They're still going to be producing automobiles. So whatever pollution took place as a result of the production of those automobiles is still going to exist regardless. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
If it were based on that, though, then there not be incentive for new manufacturing to reduce emissions? If people are paying for the new car as more money, wouldn't that, why would that give them incentive? Like, if they're paying less money because it's cheaper, wouldn't they not reduce it? It's not like
Who's they now?
the manufacturers of the cars?
Yes. Okay.
Because, so say you're telling them that they have to pay, that people get to pay less with those ones than old ones, wouldn't there not be
No, it's on the contrary. If their incremental cost, if the automobile company's incremental cost to produce the cars that are more efficient with regard to emissions and external cost and air quality degradation that are more efficient, right? Their costs go up, so their costs are going to be higher. So I guess I don't see your point. I need some help.
So you're going to be paying more money to buy
You, the buyer. Define your parties.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're going to be paying more money for
Yes, the higher quality car with regard to emissions. Yes.
right. So what is the incentive to do that if under this approach that you're saying new cars are paying less? I don't think
New cars are paying less. No, please don't give up. No, but who's paying less?
I don't know.
No, but don't give up. No, if
In this program, you're saying where old cars have to pay more because they're producing more pollution, correct?
no, I just use the example of Department of Motor Vehicle fees. I'm only talking about fees. Okay, I'm just talking about that part. If I wanted to create disincentives for the current fees, provide incentives for driving older cars. That's my point. And if you took into account the external costs that those older cars generate versus newer, more efficient emission controlling cars, then I would want my vehicle fees to be higher.
Right. My point is not only cars are reduced emissions, but if you're buying a massive 4x4, wouldn't you better off driving a station wagon from the early 90s?
Yes,
So
and more, by the way,
cars goes to older ones, people might decide,
See?
oh, they're getting cheaper anyway, that's why we come.
thank you for not giving up. You're right. But in addition, it turns out for fuel inefficient cars, for example, if you buy an Aston Martin in the state of California, you have to pay an incremental fee of $15,000 because of its fuel inefficiency. So there are programs out there. Yes. Okay.
So I like to point about it being, I think that the EMV fees, the incentives lined up by the EMV are actually, I like them, right? Because the idea of recycling the old cars, that's just an old car hard to use, right? You don't have them sitting there waiting for you to buy something used, therefore you're recycling a car and you're foregoing the cost of producing a whole new car, right? The environmental cost.